Integration of schools in Civil Rights America. In the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans were segregated in every aspect of life. Whites and blacks had separate water fountains, bathrooms, restaurants, stores, but most importantly, they had to attend different schools. This was the time period known as the Civil Rights Movement, which was a movement for African Americans to have the same rights and use the same facilities that the white Americans were able to. The segregation of America started back in the 19th century when African Americans were enslaved. After the Civil War, slavery was abolished, but African Americans still had a long road ahead of them. Before they were integrated with whites, the most impactful part of segregation was the segregation of schools. There are two very important Supreme Court cases that deal with the segregation and integration of schools. These two cases are Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. the Board of Education. Plessy v. Ferguson was the U.S. Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutional ruling that facilities could be separate based on the color of one's skin as long as facilities were both equal. This is known as separate but equal, which is not the case at all. Even though the court ruled that the facilities had to be equal, they were not, especially schools. African American students would have to walk several miles to get to school, even though there was a school just a few minutes down the road. African Americans were given the schools that did not have the same accommodations that the white schools did. There was one very important U.S. Supreme Court case that would have changed the way that American school system operated. This case was Brown v. Board of Education. This was a case that would last for 2 years because the judges involved in the case were having such a tough time deciding the verdict. The question was whether or not that the 14th Amendment included the integration of schools between blacks and whites. The case came about when a man by the name of Oliver Brown filed a lawsuit against the school system of Topeka, Kansas. He filed the lawsuit after his daughter, Linda Brown, was not allowed to enter the white elementary school in town. The local court case was lost by Mr. Brown. The court said that even though the schools were not the same, the separate but equal law was still in order. This case was just getting started, though, because of the state of Kansas ruled in favor of the segregation of schools. The NAACP legal defense got involved. Thurgood Marshall was the head of the NAACP legal defense team and took great interest in the Brown v. Board of Education case in Kansas. What many do not know is that the Brown v. Board of Education case was not just the case of Brown v. Board of Education. It was named Brown v. Board of Education when it was in the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was many cases combined because they were all fighting for the same thing, which was school integration. The case was finally over on May 17, 1954. The court decided that school segregation was illegal and schools should be integrated, and all students should have the same opportunity. This would change the American school system for forever. The country was still very hesitant on accepting the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, so much that they had another U.S. Supreme Court case, which is known as Brown 2. This case was when southern states wanted an exemption from the ruling to integrate schools. The ruling was that all states had to integrate. The ruling came in 1955. There is one county in North Carolina that had a very hard time accepting school integration. This was Hyde County, North Carolina. The county was very hesitant on being in agreement with the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. They decided that blacks could attend the white schools, but whites were not allowed to attend the black schools. While this was an improvement from complete segregation, many citizens were still not happy. After a town vote, the county decided that any student, whether they are black or white, could attend any school in the county. This was a huge step in integration of schools, even if it was just from a small town in North Carolina. One of the most famous integration of schools was at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This integration took place on September 4th, 1957. There were 9 black students that walked into Central High School on that morning. They are known as the Little Rock Nine. These 9 students were the first African Americans to sit in the classrooms with whites and to be treated equally in schools. This was a very defining moment for school integration and the Civil Rights Movement. On the day the students entered the school, there was 100 armed National Guard officers outside, while thousands of white civilians of Little Rock were opposing the integration of school. The rioting outside Central High School went on for years until Little Rock decided in 1958 that schools would close down rather than integrate at the time and cause more violence. In 1959, the schools opened back up and started to integrate. And finally, in 1972, all schools of all grades were integrated in Little Rock, Arkansas. The integration of schools was a very long and hard process in America. There were many lives that were affected by the integration of schools. Today, we do not have to worry about being segregated due to the people like Oliver Brown who stood up for what they believed in. Integration in schools is one of the best things that could have ever happened to this country. There were many factors that led to the rule over Plessy versus Ferguson, and these people and events are the reason that we are all equal today.